The first ball of the season, at Marchwood House, was the kind of room that made a woman either visible or invisible. And the room had already decided which Eleanor Vance would be. She stood near the third window with her gloved hands folded over a small leather notebook, and the candlelight that fell so generously on the diamonds at every other throat seemed to step around her plain gray silk as though it had been warned. She had worn gray because gray did not show the places where a gown had been let out and taken in across 4 seasons. She had worn it because it asked nothing of the room, and the room in turn gave her nothing back. Near the fireplace, Lady Hester Aldous lifted her fan a half-inch and let her voice carry just far enough the companion, she said as though naming a kind of furniture. Poor thing. She copies letters for a living and smiles at us as if she belongs. Eleanor heard it. She always heard it. She let the words land where they were aimed, and she smiled. The small, even smile she had practiced until it cost her nothing, and then she did what no one in that room imagined a woman like her would do. She opened the notebook against her wrist, and with the stub of a pencil she had sharpened that morning, she wrote 3 small words. Then she closed it again. Across the floor, a man who had not moved in some time turned his head. He was tall, with a stillness about him that the room read as coldness, and that Eleanor would later understand as something else entirely. He was the Duke of Carrow, and dukes did not look twice at companions. He looked twice. His gaze did not travel her gown or her empty hands. It went to the notebook, and to the pencil, and to the fact that she had not flinched, and something moved behind his face that he did not permit anyone to see. What the room did not know, what Lady Hester did not know, what even Eleanor herself had not yet fully allowed herself to believe, was that the notebook was not a diary of slights, it was a ledger, and every cruelty written in it was owed. Stay with me through this one. By the end, the room that decided who Eleanor was will be made to decide again. Now, let me take you back to how she came to be standing at that window with a pencil in her glove. Eleanor was 24 years old, and 3 years earlier she had not been a companion at all. She had been the only daughter of a country gentleman, with a modest estate, a good library, and a habit of trusting men who shook his hand warmly when her father died. The warmth went out of every handshake at once. There was a cousin, and an entail, and a stack of papers Eleanor had not been permitted to read, and within a year, the library was sold. The estate passed to the cousin, and Eleanor passed into the household of Lady Coving as a paid companion, which was the polite word for a woman who was useful and unwanted in the same breath. She had learned the household quickly. She read aloud to Lady Coving in the evenings, wrote her correspondence in a clear hand, remembered the names of every guest and every guest's grievance, and absorbed the small daily insults of a position that existed precisely so that someone of higher rank might feel higher. A companion was furniture that could be blamed. A companion was a witness who was assumed to be deaf. She did not weep over it. Weeping changed nothing. And worse, weeping told the room it had landed its blow, and Eleanor had decided early that she would give the room nothing it could enjoy. Instead, on the evening she first understood that no one intended her ever to rise again, that she would grow old, fetching shawls and copying letters, and smiling at women who would forget her face the moment she left it. She had bought a plain leather notebook from a stationer in the village with money she could not spare, and a pencil, and she had begun very quietly to take notes. Not of the insults, of the truths beneath them. When a gentleman boasted at dinner of a venture he had funded, Eleanor wrote down the venture and the sum. When a lady complained that her husband had lost more at cards than he could admit aloud, Eleanor wrote it. When Lady Hester Aldous, who ran the season the way a general runs a campaign, let slip that her family's fortune leaned hard on a single shipping concern that had not paid out in 2 years, Eleanor wrote that too, in her small, even hand, and underlined it once. The room thought it was being kind to tolerate her. The room did not understand that the most dangerous person at any table is the one everyone has agreed to ignore. The Duke of Caro was a different study. He had inherited young. After a loss the whole of society knew the shape of and none of them spoke of plainly. And he had taken up the title the way a man takes up a weight he intends never to set down. He kept his estate at Renfield in perfect order, and his face in perfect order to match. He had refused 3 seasons of introductions to suitable young women, and the dowagers had stopped offering. And the rumor had settled into fact that the Duke was made of winter. Eleanor had observed him for exactly 1 evening before she wrote, in the notebook, a single line that surprised even her. A man that still is holding something very heavy. She did not yet know what it was. She intended to find out, because finding out was the only power left to a woman the world had decided not to see. The morning after the ball, Lady Coving took a chill and kept to her rooms, and Eleanor was sent on foot to the circulating library, and the apothecary which suited her. The streets gave her room to think. She had 3 notes from the night before that wanted sorting, and she sorted them as she walked, the way another woman might hum. Lady Hester's shipping concern. A baronet's gambling debt. And the Duke, who had looked at her notebook as though he recognized it. She did not expect to see him at the apothecary's counter, and she certainly did not expect to see what he was doing there. The shop was warm and dim, lined with glass jars and the brown smell of dried herbs, and the Duke of Caro stood at the far end of it with a small boy of perhaps 6 pressed against his side. The boy was crying without sound, the way children cry when they have learned that noise brings consequences, and the Duke had crouched to the child's height, which no Duke Eleanor had ever seen would do in a public shop. On the floor between them lay the bright shards of a blue glass jar, and a dark spill of some tincture spreading slow across the boards, and the smell of it, sharp above the herbs. The boy was not the Duke's. Eleanor knew the household. The Duke had no children of his own. The boy was the apothecary's grandson, and he had knocked the jar from the high shelf reaching for a sweet, and the apothecary, a proud, frightened man with ink on his cuffs and his livelihood in a ledger he could not afford to dent, was already stammering apologies and naming a sum he plainly could not bear to lose. The Duke was quietly, without ceremony, making it right. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the spreading stain as a ruin. He named the cost of the jar, and then he named 3 more besides, to be made up and delivered to Renfield, so that the loss became, instead, an order, and the apothecary's panic had nowhere left to stand. Then the Duke leaned close to the boy and said something low against his ear, something Eleanor could not hear, and whatever it was, the silent crying stopped, and the boy wiped his face on his sleeve and nodded once, very seriously, as though he had been entrusted with a duty. The Duke straightened. He became winter again. Before anyone but Eleanor had seen the thaw, the line of his shoulders settling back into the man the season knew, the man made of carved stone. The whole of it had taken perhaps 2 minutes. No one outside the shop would ever know it had happened. Eleanor did not write it down. Some things were not evidence. Some things were simply true. And she stood very still by the door, and the Duke turned and saw her there, and for a moment neither of them performed anything at all. "Miss Vance," he said. The words were level. He knew her name. A Duke knew the name of Lady Coving's companion, which meant he had asked it, which meant the look across the ballroom had not been nothing. "Your Grace," she answered, and she did not curtsy lower than she had to, and she did not lower her eyes, and she saw that this too he noticed. "You walked," he said. It was not a question. He had seen the hem of her gown damp with the morning. "It is a poor day for walking." "It is the day I was given," she said. Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. "Come away from the door," he said. "You were letting in the cold." It was a command, flat and certain, and Eleanor's first instinct was to bristle at being ordered about by a man who ordered everyone. Yet she stepped away from the door, and only after she had done it did she understand that the draft had been falling directly on her thin shoulders, and that he had moved her out of it, and that he had disguised a kindness as an instruction because a kindness plainly offered would have obligated her, and an instruction did not. She filed that away. Not in the notebook. In herself. He bought what he had come for, and she bought what she had come for. And at the door he paused. "Lady Coving keeps you running her errands in the rain," he said. "She is fortunate in you and does not know it." "Most people do not know what they are fortunate in, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "It is the great theme of the season." That time he did smile very slightly, and it was gone almost before it arrived, and Eleanor walked home with her parcels and a strange, unfamiliar warmth high in her chest that she distrusted entirely, because warmth was a thing the world used to make women careless, and Eleanor had sworn off carelessness on the day they sold her father's books. The season pressed on. There was a card party at the Aldous house, and Eleanor attended in Lady Coving's train. Seated where companions are seated, near the wall, useful for fetching shawls. The rooms were lit to flatter, every candle placed to make the silk and the sapphires answer it, and the talk ran in its usual channels: the price of a match, the failure of a match, the small daily arithmetic by which the season weighed every soul present and found most of them wanting. Lady Hester held court at the center table in sapphires, and her daughter Cassandra sat at her right hand. 18, and lovely and trained from birth to be exactly what a duke was supposed to want. Her gloves, a shade of white that had never been let out or taken in. The whole evening had been arranged, Eleanor understood, as a stage upon which the Duke of Caro might at last be brought to see Cassandra Aldous in her best light. The Duke had been invited. The Duke had, to Lady Hester's visible irritation, not yet come, and the longer he did not come, the more brittle her good humor became, and the more sharply her attention cast about the room for something smaller to crush. "She follows him with her eyes," Lady Hester said to a friend, not bothering to lower her voice as Eleanor passed with a shawl. "The companion. Did you see her at Marchwood, scribbling in her little book like a clerk? A woman with no fortune and no name, casting her eye at a duke. It would be amusing, if it were not so pitiful. She is a clerk who has forgotten her place." There it was again. The second voicing, in a different room before a different crowd, and Eleanor felt the heat climb her throat and held her face still by an act of will she had practiced for 3 years. She fetched the shawl. She smiled. And later, in the cool of the corridor where no one watched, she opened the notebook and wrote a single line beneath the entry about the shipping concern. "The Aldous fortune is a held breath." She did not yet know how true it was. She would. The Duke arrived after 11, when the cards were nearly done, and he paid Cassandra exactly the courtesy her rank required, and not 1 degree more: a bow, a word, a glance that did not linger. And Lady Hester watched the glance fail to linger and understood it perfectly. Then he crossed the room, in front of Lady Hester, in front of everyone, and he stopped at the wall where the companion sat with her hands folded. "Miss Vance," he said, "you look as though you would rather be anywhere with a book." "Your Grace has guessed my whole character in a sentence," Eleanor said. "No," he said, "not the whole of it." And he stood there, by the wall, beside the companion, while a room full of fortune and rank pretended not to watch and watched, and Lady Hester's fan stopped moving entirely. It was a small thing. It was the largest thing that had happened to Eleanor in 3 years. She knew better than to let it mean anything. She let it mean nothing, on the surface, where the smile lived. Underneath, where the notebook could not reach, something had begun that she could not unbegin. Over the following weeks the Duke found reasons. A duke does not court a companion. There is no road for it, no precedent, no permission. There are, however, gaps in the season's machinery, small unguarded minutes, and the Duke of Caro began to appear in them. He was at the lending library when Eleanor came for Lady Coving's novels, standing among the shelves as though he had all the morning to spend, and he recommended a history she had already read, and was pleased when she told him so, and told him why he was wrong about its author. He did not take offense at being told he was wrong. He seemed, if anything, to grow more attentive, the way a man leans toward a fire he had not expected to find lit. He was on the path through the park when she walked there, the bare autumn trees gray above them and the gravel wet underfoot, and he fell into step at a proper distance. And he said little. And the little he said was always either a command disguised as care or a question he had no practical reason to ask except that he wished to know the answer. "You do not flatter," he said once, on the path, the bare autumn trees gray above them. "Flattery is a currency, your grace," she said. "I was not left with much, but I keep what I have. What do you keep it for?" She had not meant to answer truthfully. The truth came out anyway, which frightened her more than any insult had. "For the day someone needs the truth," she said, "and cannot find anyone who has saved any." He stopped walking. She felt him stop without looking, which had begun to happen to her, this awful awareness of exactly where, in any room, he stood. He looked at her as though she had said something he had waited a long time to hear, and then he gave her an instruction. "Walk with me to the gate," he said. "It is growing cold." And she walked with him to the gate, and her hand at her side was not steady. And she despised her hand for it, and she went anyway. You feel where this is going. So, did she. She simply did not yet permit herself to believe it could be allowed. The wound surfaced on an evening that had not been arranged for any purpose at all. Lady Coving had been invited to dine at Renfield, the Duke's own house, on the strength of an old connection between the families. And Eleanor came in her train, as always. And after dinner the company drifted to the music room, and Eleanor, who had no part in such drifting, found herself instead in the long gallery. Before a portrait that had been turned to face the wall. The gallery was cold and very quiet, lit only by a branch of candles near the door, and the rows of Caro ancestors watched her pass from their gilt frames, generation on generation of certain faces. Only one frame faced away. Only one had been turned. Deliberately, the canvas to the plaster and the bare stretcher and the brown back of it to the room, as though the man who hung it could not bear the company of whoever it held. She did not turn it. She would not have. The Duke had come in behind her without sound, and he saw her standing before the reversed frame, and he said very low, "My sister." Eleanor said nothing. She had learned that silence is the only door grief will walk through. She was to marry, he said, and his voice had none of its level certainty now. It was a man's voice, and not a Duke's. "I did not approve the match. I had reasons. They were good reasons. I was certain of them the way I am. Certain of very little, and I forbade it. And she did as I asked because she trusted me more than she trusted her own heart." He stopped. She did not recover from the obedience. She faded the way a fire fades when no one will let it have any air. I turned her portrait to the wall the day she died because I could not look at what my certainty had cost. I have not turned it back. It was the only time he would say it. Eleanor understood that, and honored it, and did not reach for him, though every part of her wished to. Instead, she said the one true thing she had. "Then you know," she said, "what it is to be made small by someone certain of your own good. I will not tell you it was not your fault. You would not believe me, and I do not lie to be kind. But I will tell you that a man who turns the portrait to the wall is a man who learned, and the learning was bought too dear to waste." He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight of the gallery, and his hand rose halfway between them, and stopped, and did not arrive. And the not arriving was louder than any touch could have been. "Miss Vance," he said. And then, deliberately, as a man steps off a high place. Eleanor, her given name, in his voice undid 3 years of practice in a single breath. She did not let it show. She let it live, only where it had landed, somewhere beneath the ledger and the smile in the place she had sworn never to open again. Then footsteps came along the gallery and they stepped apart before the candle could betray them. And Lady Hester swept in with Cassandra on her arm and her eyes already narrowing, because Lady Hester had not built her position by failing to notice when a companion stood too long in the dark with a Duke. What followed? Lady Hester built carefully the way she built, everything. She went first to Lady Coving, and she was all concern, and she observed, gently, that the companion was perhaps growing above herself, that there was talk, that a woman in Eleanor's position could not afford talk, and that it would be a kindness truly to let her go before her reputation made her unplaceable. Lady Coving, who was neither cruel nor brave, wavered. Then Lady Hester went to work on the season itself, a word here, a raised brow there, the machinery, she commanded, turning its attention to the grinding of one small, unimportant woman. And then she did the thing that revealed she was frightened, though Eleanor did not yet know what frightened her. She arranged for the Duke to be cornered, publicly, at the largest assembly of the season, the great autumn ball at Carrington Rooms, and she arranged for Eleanor to be there to witness it, because a wound witnessed cuts deeper than a wound delivered in private. At the height of the evening, before the whole of society, Lady Hester guided the conversation, with the skill of long practice, to the subject of the Duke's marriage. And she presented Cassandra, radiant in white, and she said, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner, including the corner where Eleanor stood with Lady Coving's fan, "Your Grace must marry. The house requires it. And surely a man of your discernment knows the difference between a lady and a clerk who scribbles in a book and dreams above her station." The room went still. Every face turned, some openly, most behind fans, all of them feeding. There was the third voicing, in the most public room of all, and it was meant to be the killing one. Eleanor stood at the edge of the light and felt the whole season's verdict settle on her like cold water, and her hand on the fan went white at the knuckle, and she understood that she was meant, now, to be erased. She looked at the Duke. The Duke looked at Lady Hester, and in the silence Eleanor saw him decide something, and her heart, the foolish ungoverned thing, broke a little, because she was certain she knew what a duke would decide. He said nothing in her defense. Not then. He inclined his head to Lady Hester with perfect, terrible courtesy, and he said only that the matter of his marriage was his own. And he turned and left the floor, and Eleanor watched him go, and told herself she had always known. She had written it in her own notebook the first night. Dukes do not look twice at companions. And any warmth that says otherwise is a thing the world uses to make a woman careless. That was the dark of it. Lady Coving, pressed past her courage, told Eleanor that evening that her services would no longer be required, that she might stay the fortnight to find another place, and that it was nothing personal. It is never personal. That is the cruelty of it. Eleanor packed her 2 trunks by candlelight and laid the notebook on top. And she did not weep, and the not weeping was the hardest thing she had ever done. Eleanor Vance had not, however, survived 3 years by mistaking a single move for the whole game. She sat up that night with the notebook open, and she read it from the first page. 3 years of small, even truths, and she understood at last what she was holding. She was holding the Aldous fortune, which was a held breath, leaning on a shipping concern that had not paid in 2 years. She was holding the name of the man who held the Aldous debts. And she was holding, in the Duke's own grief, the thing he valued above his comfort, which was never again to let his certainty crush a woman who had done nothing but love beyond her station. She did not go to the Duke. That was important to her. She would not be a problem he solved. Instead, she went, the next morning, on foot in the rain, to the offices of the solicitor whose name appeared 4 times in her notebook, a Mr. Reed, who managed accounts for half the great houses and was owed money by the other half. The office was up a narrow stair, dim and smelling of tallow and old paper, and Mr. Prawny. Reed was a spare, gray man who looked up from his desk with the weary patience of one expecting to refuse a request for charity. He did not expect the woman in the wet gray gown to lay a plain leather notebook on his blotter and open it herself to the page she meant. She laid it open to the pages that mattered, and she did not ask him for anything. She simply showed him what she had seen, recorded, dated, and true, in a small, even hand that no clerk of his could have bettered. "Read the entries I have marked," she said. "Then tell me whether a careful man would lend another shilling against the Aldous name. Mr. Reed read. His patience left his face by degrees, and something sharper took its place. He read the line about the shipping concern that had not paid in 2 years. He read the dates. He read the sums Lady Hester had borrowed against a fortune that no longer existed, to fund a season designed to marry her daughter into rank before the held breath was let out. He read it twice. Then he looked at the plain woman across his desk, and he revised very thoroughly his opinion of who in this city mattered. "You understand what this is," he said. "I understand exactly what it is," Eleanor said. "I have understood for 3 years. I am only now in a position to say so." "Most women in your position," he said slowly, "would have brought this to me with a price attached." "I have no price," she said. "I have only the truth, and a wish that honest men should not throw good money after a lie. What you do with it is your affair. I came so that you could not later say no one had told you." She asked him for nothing further. She asked him only to do his honest duty by his honest clients, which was to know the truth of an account before more good money chased it. What he did with the truth was his to decide. Then she went home and waited. And she did not write the Duke, and she did not write anyone. And she let the truth do what truth does when it is finally let into a room. It moved faster than she had dared hope. Within the week, the season had begun to whisper a different name in a different tone, and the whisper was Aldous, and the word attached to it was not clerk, but ruin. Creditors who had smiled now called. The shipping concern, pressed, confessed its emptiness. And Lady Hester, who had run the season like a general, discovered that an army deserts the moment it learns the war chest is bare. The reckoning came where the wound had been given. There was a final great assembly at Carrington Rooms. The same room, the same chandeliers burning their 100 candles, the same long mirrors throwing the light back doubled, the same crowd that had turned its faces to feed. The season gathered to it, not knowing whether it came to see a triumph or a fall, only certain that something would break, and the certainty had drawn even those who rarely came, so that the rooms were full past comfort and the air was warm with watching. Lady Hester came, because not to come was to confess. She came in her sapphires with Cassandra pale beside her, and she held her chin at the exact angle she had held it for 30 years, and she had perhaps one move left, which was to find the companion in the crowd and break her publicly one last time, so that the room would look at Eleanor's fall instead of her own. She found her. Eleanor had come as the guest of Mr. Reed, who had his own reasons for wishing to be seen as a man with friends, and she stood in a gown of deep green that Mr. Reed's wife had pressed upon her, plain still beside the diamonds, but no longer apologizing for itself. And for the first time in 3 years the candlelight did not step around her. Lady Hester crossed the floor with her fan raised like a blade, and the nearest faces turned, scenting it, and the circle of attention widened and hushed. "So," she said, low and venomous, for Eleanor alone and for the dozen nearest ears she intended to reach, "the clerk has come up in the world. Borrowed silk and a borrowed friend. I wonder how long it lasts. I wonder who you scribbled about to buy a single evening. Above your proper place. Lady Hester." The voice was level and it carried, and the room turned, because the room knew that voice, and the Duke of Carrow was crossing the floor toward them in 3 long strides with every eye upon him, and his face was not winter now. It was something the season had never been permitted to see. He did not look at Lady Hester. He looked at Eleanor, and he stopped before her. And in the silence that the whole great room had become, in the same room where the verdict had been handed down, he spoke once clearly, so that no fan in the place could pretend not to hear it. "Miss Vance has agreed to be my wife. P. had not asked her. She had not agreed." The room did not know that, and it did not matter, because as the words landed Eleanor looked up at him and understood that he had crossed the whole distance she had refused to let him cross, had laid his rank down in front of the people who worshipped it, and was now waiting, with his certain face gone soft and frightened, for her to make the lie a truth or let it fall. He had not solved her like a problem. He had stood beside her and put himself in her hands. A held breath went around the room. Lady Hester's fan came down. Her mouth opened and produced nothing. The sapphires at her throat caught the light and meant suddenly very little, and Cassandra at her side looked at her mother with the first clear sight of her young life, and the crowd, that great fickle witnessing crowd, began to turn the way a tide turns, all at once and without apology, toward the Duke and the woman in green. Mr. Reed, near the wall, inclined his head, and the inclination confirmed for everyone watching that this was not scandal, but settlement, witnessed, lawful, done. Eleanor did not gloat. She had promised herself she would not, on the night they sold her father's books, that if a day of vindication ever came, she would meet it with grace, and not with teeth. She looked at Lady Hester, who had called her clerk in 3 rooms, and she found she had nothing to avenge. Only a woman whose script had worked everywhere except here. She said nothing cruel. She said nothing at all to Lady Hester. She turned to the Duke, and she gave him, for the first time in public, the smile she had never spent on anyone. The real one, the one the notebook had no entry for. "Yes," she said, only to him. "I have." He let out a breath. She suspected he had been holding for 3 years of his own. They were married in the early winter, quietly, at Renfield, with no great crowd to witness it, because the witnessing was finished and what remained was only the living. Lady Hester withdrew from the season and from the city. She was not destroyed, only displaced. The held breath finally let out, and in time she learned to live smaller, which is its own slow correction. Cassandra, freed from the campaign, surprised everyone, including herself, by marrying a country clergyman she actually liked. And Mr. Reed kept the notebook's secrets, because Eleanor asked him to, for she had no further use for other people's ruin now that she had no need to trade in it. The first snow came the week of the wedding. Eleanor stood at the long gallery window at Renfield in the early dark, watching it fall over grounds that were hers now, to walk in daylight or rain as she pleased, the flakes catching the last gray light and settling on the box hedges and the stone urns and the long avenue of bare limes. Behind her on the wall, the portrait of the Duke's sister hung face out at last. A young woman with a clear, direct gaze, and the ghost of a notebook habit in the set of her hands. He had turned it himself, the morning after the assembly, without being asked, and he had stood a long while before it. And then he had come and found Eleanor, and said only, "She would have liked you." She kept the notebook, too. It was the nearest thing to peace Eleanor had seen in his face. The notebook itself lay now in a drawer of her own writing desk, closed, its work complete. She did not burn it. Some truths are worth keeping even when they are no longer weapons, and still she did not open it either. The woman who had needed it had been a woman the world refused to see, and that woman was gone, witnessed at last into something else. The Duke came into the gallery as the light failed, and he did not give her a command, which she noticed, because the commands had always been the disguise his care wore when care was not allowed. Care was allowed now. He simply stood beside her at the window and watched the snow with her, and after a while he took her hand, the same hand that had once gone white on a borrowed fan, and held it without instruction and without apology. And Eleanor, who had smiled at every insult and saved every truth, let herself stop saving and simply be held. Outside the snow went on falling, soft and unhurried, over the cold gray stone and the bare trees and the dark grounds, and it covered the path she had so often walked in the rain, and it covered the gate where he had first told her it was growing cold, and the window held the two of them in its warm square of light like a thing kept safe at last from the long winter of the world. If Eleanor's story stayed with you, stay a moment in your own evening. And remember the ones the world has decided not to see. They are often the ones taking the most careful notes. Thank you for staying until the end.